New York City, 1931. Smoke hangs low over the streets, curling around lamplights and seeping through alleyways that never sleep. The city hums with life: bootleggers, jazz clubs, crooked politicians, and men with guns under their coats. It is an age of opportunity and violence, a time when law and order are words printed in newspapers, not realities in the streets. Amidst this chaos stands one man whose shadow stretches across every borough: Charles "Lucky" Luciano. To some, he is a criminal mastermind; to others, a visionary who gave form to disorder. His name will come to define the architecture of modern organized crime in America. But this story is not merely about crime. It is about the evolution of power, how a boy from the slums of Sicily would rise to reshape the American underworld into something cold, methodical, and enduring. Luciano didn't just run rackets, he built systems. He replaced superstition with strategy, tradition with enterprise. The Mafia, once bound by feudal loyalty and narrow codes of honor, would under his hand become a national corporation of crime, one that mimicked legitimate business more than it did its Sicilian roots. The America Luciano inherited was fertile ground for such a transformation. Prohibition had turned everyday citizens into lawbreakers, and the very institutions meant to uphold the law were drowning in corruption. Every cop had a price. Every judge had a secret. In this world, morality was a luxury few could afford. The poor fought to survive. The clever learned to manipulate survival into power. Luciano was both poor and clever, a combination that would make him dangerous. Yet beneath the glittering violence of the 1920s underworld lay something more profound: a struggle for identity. Immigrants like Luciano were outsiders in a land that exploited their labor but rejected their presence. They built their own worlds within tenements, their own economies, their own hierarchies of trust and fear. The Mafia, in its earliest American form, was less a criminal organization than a survival mechanism. It provided protection where the state offered none, opportunity where poverty was absolute. Luciano understood this instinctively. He saw that power wasn't merely about guns and money, it was about systems that made both inevitable. The early decades of the 20th century were littered with figures who ruled through intimidation, gang bosses who mistook fear for leadership. Luciano would change that. He envisioned something far more stable, something lasting. His genius wasn't just in what he did but in how he thought. Crime, to him, was a business model that could be standardized, managed, and expanded. It required vision, diplomacy, and ruthless clarity. In many ways, Luciano was the first modern executive of crime. He knew when to kill, but more importantly, he knew when not to. His partnerships with Jewish and Irish gangsters, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and others, broke ethnic barriers that had divided the underworld for decades. Where others saw betrayal, Luciano saw opportunity. To him, race and heritage were irrelevant compared to loyalty and profit. This pragmatic worldview made him a revolutionary among criminals. The city reflected him. Beneath the polished towers of Manhattan, its foundations were soaked in liquor money and protection rackets. Politicians dined with bootleggers. Police captains took their cut. And as America staggered from the Great Depression into an uncertain new decade, Luciano's invisible hand guided a shadow economy that thrived where the legitimate one faltered. His influence ran from the docks to the mayor's office, from the brothels of the Bowery to the penthouses of Park Avenue. Yet for all his control, Luciano was haunted by a paradox. To bring order to chaos, he would have to become the very thing he despised: a tyrant within a brotherhood built on equality. The price of leadership in the underworld was betrayal. The more he built, the more fragile his empire became. This story begins at the intersection of morality and ambition, a place where loyalty is currency and violence is policy. It's a story of transformation, of how Lucky Luciano didn't just inherit the Mafia, he reinvented it. The tale of his rise is also the story of America itself, a nation built on dreams, greed, and the relentless pursuit of control. Before the end, the line between law and crime, justice and vengeance, will blur beyond recognition. The man at the center of it all, suave, calculating, and terrifyingly modern, will redefine what it means to be a criminal in the 20th century. His legacy will not fade with his death. It will echo in every organized crime family that followed, in every empire built on silence and profit. This is not just the biography of a gangster. It is the origin story of an idea, the American Mafia as imagined by Lucky Luciano. At the dawn of the 20th century, America was a land of contradictions, a nation built on promises of freedom, yet driven by inequality, greed, and corruption. For the waves of Sicilian immigrants arriving in New York, Those promises quickly dissolved into the hard reality of tenement life. They came from villages ruled by silence and honor, where the Mafia had existed for centuries as a shadow government, a system born from mistrust of authority, designed to protect the powerless through fear and loyalty. When these men crossed the Atlantic, they carried that system with them, hidden like a family heirloom inside their culture. The old Mafia of Sicily was not an organization in the modern sense. It was a way of life, a code of behavior that valued discretion, secrecy, and vengeance. In the hills of Palermo or the dusty roads of Corleone, justice was personal. The government was distant and corrupt, so men like Don Vito Cascioferro or Don Calogero Vizzini filled the vacuum, dispensing protection in exchange for obedience. The law of omerta, silence, was absolute. To speak to the police was to betray your own blood. This system had kept the Sicilian underclass alive for generations, but in America, it began to mutate. When the immigrants settled in the crowded neighborhoods of New York's Lower East Side, East Harlem, and Brooklyn, they found themselves at the bottom of a ruthless social order. Irish gangs controlled the docks. Jewish gangs ran the gambling halls. The Italians, divided by region and dialect, had little unity. The old country bosses, the so-called mustache Petes, tried to impose the Sicilian order, demanding respect, tribute, and loyalty as if they were still in Palermo. But America was not Sicily. The rules were different here. The pace was faster, the temptations greater, and the law weaker. The mustache Petes ruled by tradition and paranoia. Men like Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano believed in old rituals, handshakes, blood oaths, and rigid hierarchy. They distrusted anyone who wasn't purely Sicilian, viewing Jewish or Irish associates as outsiders. In their minds, crime was a family business, not a network. To them, honor mattered more than money. But to the younger generation, led by men like Charles Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Frank Costello, honor without profit was meaningless. America rewarded innovation, not obedience. By the 1920s, the city's underworld had become a mosaic of ethnic factions constantly at war. The Irish controlled the police and the political machines. The Jews dominated gambling and finance. The Italians, though growing in number, were consumed by infighting. In the shadows, each group fought for the same thing: power. Yet while the old bosses clung to ancient traditions, the younger criminals adapted to modern America. They saw opportunity in chaos. The transformation of the Mafia from an old-world fraternity into an American empire began quietly, in backrooms and speakeasies. The Young Turks, as they were called, met in secret: Luciano, Lansky, Siegel, Costello, and others. They studied the methods of men like Arnold Rothstein, the gambler and financier who turned illegal enterprise into organized business. They understood that America's new economy, powered by prohibition, corruption, and ambition, demanded a new kind of leader. In this fractured world, Lucky Luciano emerged as a bridge between two eras. He understood both the mustache Pete's obsession with loyalty and the new generation's hunger for efficiency. He saw the weakness in the old order. It was too small-minded, too parochial, too emotional. He realized that in America, the Mafia could be more than a neighborhood operation. It could be a national syndicate. But first he would have to destroy the old guard. The cultural tension between the Sicilian traditionalists and the ambitious reformers mirrored the larger immigrant experience. America was changing its people, and they were changing America. The sons of immigrants no longer wanted to live in the shadows of their fathers. They wanted to own nightclubs, wear tailored suits, dine in Manhattan's finest restaurants. For them, crime was not a curse, it was a career. Luciano embodied that new psychology: practical, unemotional, and forward-thinking. He respected power, not ritual. As the 1920s progressed, the balance of power began to tilt. Prohibition created fortunes overnight. Smuggling liquor across state lines required logistics, partnerships, and strategy, qualities the old Mafia lacked. Luciano and his allies built networks that crossed ethnic and territorial lines. They spoke the language of money, not dialects of Sicily. Where Masuria and Maranzano clung to old-world feuds, Luciano's circle focused on profits and efficiency. The American Mafia was being born, not through loyalty to the past but through adaptation to the future. Still, the transition was not smooth. Blood had to be spilled. The mustache Pete saw Luciano's generation as disrespectful traitors who had forgotten their roots. The Young Turks saw the old men as obstacles standing in the way of progress. It was inevitable that this cultural divide would explode into violence, a war that would decide the soul of organized crime in America. But before the shooting started, before alliances were tested, the stage had to be set. By the late 1920s, New York's criminal underworld was a pressure cooker of ambition and resentment. The old mafia clung to its crumbling throne while the new breed plotted revolution behind closed doors. The streets were changing, and soon the blood of the old world would baptize the birth of the new. Charles "Lucky" Luciano was born Salvatore Lucania in 1897 in Lercara Fritti, a small Sicilian town scarred by poverty, violence, and rigid social hierarchies. The son of a barber and a seamstress, he grew up in a world where survival depended on cunning, strength, and the ability to navigate unspoken codes of behavior. Life in Sicily was unforgiving. Families lived in tight-knit communities, but every street, every alley, carried the threat of vendetta. Honor dictated action, and a single misstep could lead to death. These early lessons in observation, strategy, and self-preservation would later become the invisible architecture of Luciano's empire. At age 9, Luciano and his family emigrated to New York City, seeking the promise of opportunity in America. The Lower East Side, however, was a far cry from the hopes they carried. Crowded tenements, filth-choked streets, and relentless poverty greeted them. For a young boy, survival required more than obedience. It required wit, speed, and a readiness to fight. Luciano absorbed these lessons quickly. He witnessed men crushed by circumstance, women exploited, and the law failing those who needed it most. From an early age, he understood the mechanics of fear, leverage, and loyalty, tools he would later use to manipulate friends, foes, and institutions alike. School offered little escape. Luciano attended public schools briefly but was quickly drawn into the streets, where education took a different form. He learned arithmetic by counting bets and debts, geography by mapping escape routes through alleys, and psychology by reading the moods and intentions of men far older than himself. The Lower East Side was a crucible for ambition. Gangs were everywhere, and their leaders demanded respect, sometimes violently, often arbitrarily. Luciano, small for his age but quick and calculating, learned to assert himself not through raw strength but through intellect and audacity. He watched older boys rise and fall, memorizing strategies for alliances, betrayals, and survival. By his teenage years, Luciano had already begun carving a path into the underworld. He took odd jobs during the day, delivering newspapers, working in factories, but his nights were spent navigating the labyrinth of street gangs, saloons, and illicit rackets. He met Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel during these years, forming alliances that would redefine American organized crime. Luciano's charm and intelligence drew people to him, but it was his strategic mind that earned respect. He could anticipate rivals' moves, manipulate situations to his advantage, and orchestrate chaos in a way that few could comprehend. Family life also shaped Luciano's psychology. His father, a man of pride and principle, instilled discipline and the idea that respect was earned, not given. His mother's resilience and resourcefulness impressed upon him the value of adaptability. But the streets demanded more than parental guidance. Here, the world rewarded cunning and punished naivety. Every interaction was a test, every handshake a potential trap. Luciano thrived under pressure, learning to balance charm with intimidation, empathy with calculation. He was developing the duality that would define him, a man who could laugh with allies while planning their rivals' downfall. Luciano's first brushes with the law were inevitable. Juvenile arrests for petty theft, assaults, and truancy marked his adolescence. But these encounters with authority only sharpened his understanding of power and its limits. He realized that fear of punishment could be leveraged and that the law, like any human system, was susceptible to influence. He internalized a critical lesson. Survival depended not only on strength but on perception. To control others, one had to control how they saw you. In this environment, Luciano's ambitions began to crystallize. Unlike many street kids content with territory or reputation, he had a vision. He didn't merely want to dominate his block, he wanted to dominate the city. He understood the fragmented nature of New York's underworld, divided by ethnicity, age, and tradition, and saw opportunity where others saw chaos. Luciano's mind worked like a strategist's. Every fight, every alliance, every risk was a calculated move toward a larger goal. By the early 1920s, he had established himself as a rising figure in the Italian-American criminal scene. He began working under established bosses but quickly grew frustrated with the rigidity of the old guard. The mustache Petes, steeped in Sicilian tradition, could not match his vision. Their obsession with loyalty and ancestry clashed with his focus on efficiency and profit. Luciano began to cultivate his own network of trusted allies, including non-Italians like Lansky and Siegel, signaling a revolutionary break from tradition. Luciano's psychological makeup, a combination of adaptability, strategic foresight, and fearlessness, allowed him to navigate the perilous streets of early 20th century New York. He understood human behavior, reading intentions, weaknesses, and opportunities with near-constant precision. Where others saw only risk, he saw leverage. Where others saw enemies, he saw potential partners. His early years were marked by hardship, violence, and observation, all of which honed the instincts that would allow him to rise above his peers. By the time he reached his mid-20s, Luciano was no longer just a street kid. He was a calculating operator with ambition as vast as the city itself. He had learned the rules of survival in the harshest environment imaginable and had already begun rewriting them in his favor. The foundation of his empire, intelligence, alliances, ruthlessness, and vision, was laid not in boardrooms or courtrooms, but in the alleys, tenements, and backrooms of immigrant New York. The 1920s in America were a decade of contradiction: wealth and want, jazz and violence, speakeasies and police raids. Prohibition, enacted in 1920, had inadvertently created a criminal goldmine. Liquor, once legal and mundane, became the most lucrative commodity in the nation. Smuggling, bootlegging, and the clandestine sale of alcohol transformed petty gangs into powerful syndicates almost overnight. For a streetwise opportunist like Charles "Lucky" Luciano, this was more than chance, it was destiny. The law had created a vacuum and Luciano was poised to fill it. Luciano's rise during Prohibition was neither sudden nor accidental. He had learned the streets, understood human behavior, and cultivated relationships that transcended ethnicity and personal loyalty. He recognized that survival required not only force but diplomacy. Unlike the rigid mustache Petes who relied on fear and heritage, Luciano forged partnerships with Jewish and Irish gangsters, men like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, who shared his ambition and pragmatism. These alliances were revolutionary. In a world where loyalty was traditionally defined by blood, Luciano measured loyalty by utility and competence. Bootlegging became the crucible in which Luciano honed his leadership and organizational skills. The logistics of moving alcohol, from Canadian rivers and New Jersey docks to New York speakeasies, required meticulous planning, coordination, and the ability to manage people who were as dangerous as the cargo itself. Luciano approached these operations like a businessman. He delegated, negotiated, and collected his cut without unnecessary violence, unless provoked. By blending cunning with calculated force, he transformed chaotic street crime into a structured, profitable enterprise. At the same time, Luciano demonstrated an uncanny ability to navigate the political landscape. Police, politicians, and judges were often as corrupt as the criminals they were meant to apprehend. Luciano learned to cultivate these relationships quietly, ensuring protection and immunity from interference. He understood that power extended beyond muscle. Influence, bribery, and psychological manipulation were equally critical tools. By the mid-1920s, Luciano had established a reputation as both a dangerous adversary and a man to be respected. While bootlegging provided the wealth, Luciano's true genius was in structuring the underworld. The old Mafia had relied on fragmented families, each operating independently, often at odds with each other. Violence was frequent, and disputes were resolved by bloodshed rather than negotiation. Luciano envisioned something radically different. He saw the potential to unify these disparate gangs under a single coordinated system, a mafia that operated like a corporation with divisions, hierarchies, and a code of conduct that ensured both efficiency and stability. The Castellammarese War, which erupted in the late 1920s, would test this vision. A brutal feud between Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano for control of New York's Italian gangs resulted in countless deaths, forcing young leaders like Luciano to choose sides. Unlike many of his peers, Luciano was pragmatic rather than dogmatic. He carefully observed, calculated risk, and positioned himself as a broker of peace, but peace on his terms. His willingness to manipulate alliances and orchestrate betrayals would ultimately allow him to eliminate the old guard and consolidate power. Luciano's early operations were also marked by innovation. He recognized that diversification was essential to long-term survival. Bootlegging provided immediate wealth, but Luciano expanded into gambling, prostitution, narcotics, and labor racketeering. He turned vice into a multi-layered enterprise, with specialized crews managing different operations, while he maintained oversight and strategic control. This approach mirrored legitimate business practices, further distinguishing him from traditional mob bosses. Equally important was Luciano's psychological approach to leadership. He cultivated loyalty not merely through fear but through opportunity. Trusted associates were rewarded generously, and talent was recognized regardless of ethnic background. This meritocratic philosophy attracted the brightest, most ambitious operators to his side, solidifying his network of influence. His ability to inspire loyalty while maintaining ruthless control would become a hallmark of his leadership style. By the end of Prohibition, Luciano was not merely a street-level operator. He was a strategic mastermind, orchestrating a network that spanned New York and beyond. The era of chaotic gang rule was ending, replaced by a system that would endure for decades. Bootlegging had been the catalyst, but Luciano's vision, organization, alliances, and disciplined expansion was the foundation. He had turned opportunity into empire, violence into leverage, and ambition into structure. Prohibition's repeal in 1933 would challenge every bootlegger, but Luciano had already diversified his operations enough to weather the transition. More importantly, he had proven that he was not just a product of circumstance, but a man capable of shaping circumstances themselves. The streets had tested him, and he had emerged not only richer but smarter, more influential, and more prepared to reshape the American Mafia entirely. Luciano's rise during Prohibition illustrates a critical lesson. Power is not solely about force, wealth, or fear. It is about vision, adaptability, and the ability to exploit systemic change. In the crucible of illegal enterprise, he learned to balance strategy and violence, loyalty and betrayal, charm and intimidation. By the close of the 1920s, Lucky Luciano had not only survived the violent, chaotic streets of New York, he had begun to control them. He was no longer a street kid from the Lower East Side. He was a future architect of America's criminal underworld. By the early 1930s, Charles Lucky Luciano had amassed wealth, influence, and a reputation that extended across the boroughs of New York. Yet for all his success, he recognized that the true barrier to enduring power was the old structure of the Mafia itself. The so-called Mustache Petes, men like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, clung to rigid, outdated hierarchies, bound by notions of heritage, ethnicity, and tradition. Loyalty, in their view, was tied to bloodlines and birthplace rather than skill, intellect, or ambition. Violence was the method of governance, not strategy. For Luciano, this approach was fundamentally flawed. It was chaotic, inefficient, and vulnerable to collapse. He envisioned a different order, a system where crime was organized, rules were standardized, and power was distributed rationally. Luciano's vision extended beyond the borders of New York. He saw an opportunity to transform the American underworld into a national enterprise. To do so, he needed not only to consolidate power within the Italian-American gangs but also to create alliances with other ethnic groups, Jews, Irish, and even select Protestants who could be trusted. These partnerships were radical for the time. The old Mafia viewed non-Italians with suspicion or outright disdain. Luciano, however, was pragmatic. Loyalty and competence outweighed heritage. If a man could execute orders, manage operations, and generate profit, he was an ally. If he could not, he was expendable. This philosophy allowed Luciano to recruit the most talented criminals regardless of ethnicity, dramatically expanding the reach and efficiency of his enterprise. Central to Luciano's vision was the creation of what would later be called the Commission, a governing council designed to arbitrate disputes, coordinate operations, and maintain stability within the underworld. The idea was revolutionary. Rather than relying on bloody feuds and spontaneous enforcement, the Commission would function like a corporate board, mediating conflicts, enforcing rules, and distributing territory in a predictable, orderly manner. Luciano understood that the survival of the Mafia depended on reducing internal conflict. Violence would still be a tool, but it would be wielded strategically rather than haphazardly. In this sense, Luciano was not merely a gangster. He was an architect, a strategist turning chaos into infrastructure. Luciano's psychological insight into power dynamics was as critical as his organizational genius. He understood fear, respect, and loyalty as currencies of influence. He cultivated relationships carefully, rewarding competence and punishing disloyalty. Unlike his predecessors who ruled primarily through intimidation, Luciano blended charisma with authority. Men who worked for him did so willingly, motivated by both fear and opportunity. This dual approach created a sense of cohesion that the old Mafia had never achieved. In essence, Luciano was building not just an organization but a culture. One where rules were clear, roles were defined, and ambition could be channeled productively rather than destructively. The Castellamarese War, which had devastated New York's Italian-American gangs, provided the perfect proving ground for Luciano's ideas. He orchestrated the downfall of Mafia and Maranzano not merely to seize power, but to clear the way for systemic reform. Once the old bosses were removed, Luciano implemented his vision, dividing power among families, establishing protocols for cooperation, and creating a council to manage disputes. The American Mafia would no longer be a loose collection of feuding families, it would be a network of interdependent, hierarchically organized entities. This system also reflected Luciano's understanding of the broader American context. Unlike Sicily, where the Mafia operated in a relatively insular environment, the American underworld intersected with politics, business, and law enforcement in complex ways. Luciano recognized that to sustain his empire, he needed influence far beyond the streets. He fostered relationships with politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials, ensuring protection and leverage when necessary. By integrating legal and illegal networks, he blurred the lines between legitimate and illicit power, creating a structure resilient to both internal dissent and external threats. Moreover, Luciano's vision emphasized scalability. He recognized that opportunity was not confined to New York. By codifying rules, mediating disputes, and standardizing operations, he created a model that could be replicated in Chicago, Philadelphia, and beyond. The principles of the Commission, shared authority, conflict resolution, and profit-driven cooperation, became the blueprint for national organized crime. Luciano's foresight ensured that the Mafia could survive leadership changes, law enforcement crackdowns, and market fluctuations. He was thinking generations ahead, not merely years. The psychological sophistication of Luciano's system was equally remarkable. He understood that absolute power is fragile, and that loyalty must be cultivated through a combination of fear, respect, and opportunity. He gave ambitious lieutenants a chance to thrive, but always within the framework of his authority. He allowed personal ambition to exist, but only insofar as it served the greater structure. Betrayal, once rare and personal, became a calculated risk with clear consequences. By shaping both behavior and perception, Luciano created an organization in which individuals internalized its rules, ensuring cohesion without constant supervision. Luciano's transformation of the Mafia was not merely structural, it was philosophical. He replaced superstition with strategy, tradition with pragmatism, and emotion with calculation. Where the Mustache Petes had valued honor above all, Luciano valued results. Where they had relied on fear and intimidation alone, he combined leverage with opportunity. This approach allowed him to dominate without drawing unnecessary attention, to command loyalty without resorting to constant violence. In every sense, Luciano's vision redefined what it meant to wield power in the underworld. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano was more than a powerful gangster, he was a revolutionary. His ideas about organization, alliances, and strategic leadership transformed the American Mafia from a collection of feuding families into a cohesive, enduring system. He was the first to view crime not merely as a series of violent acts but as an enterprise to be managed, optimized, and scaled. In doing so, Luciano laid the foundation for decades of organized crime, creating a legacy that extended far beyond his own lifetime. Progress, however, was never free of blood. For every alliance Luciano forged and every system he implemented, there was violence lurking in the shadows. The very act of reshaping the Mafia meant dismantling the old guard, men who had survived decades through brute force and unquestioned loyalty. The Castellamarese War, which erupted in 1930, was the crucible in which Luciano's ideas were tested. It was a conflict as much about culture and psychology as about territory, the old-school Sicilian bosses versus the young, pragmatic innovators who valued profit over tradition. Every street corner, every nightclub, every dockside warehouse became a theater of calculation and death. The war began as a power struggle between Joe, the boss Mafia, the reigning patriarch of the Italian gangs, and Salvatore Maranzano, leader of the Castellamarese faction. Both men were ruthless, steeped in Sicilian codes, and determined to maintain control at any cost. Thousands of minor skirmishes, murders, and kidnappings left the city's underworld in chaos. For the average citizen, it was terrifying, explosions of violence in otherwise ordinary neighborhoods. For Luciano, it was an opportunity. He understood that the only way to implement his vision was to remove the old guard entirely, to replace chaos with structure. But doing so required patience, cunning, and moral flexibility. Luciano's approach to the war was methodical. Unlike his predecessors who relied solely on brute force, he employed strategy, persuasion, and psychological manipulation. He cultivated allies within both factions, playing them against each other while keeping his own ambitions hidden. His ability to anticipate human behavior allowed him to predict reactions, identify weaknesses, and exploit divisions. To Mafia, Luciano appeared loyal and obedient. Behind the scenes he was plotting the boss's downfall. To Maranzano he presented himself as a potential partner, someone capable of bridging the gap between generations and factions. This duality, the capacity to appear trustworthy while orchestrating betrayal, would become a hallmark of Luciano's genius. The psychological dimension of power during this period cannot be overstated. Fear had always been a tool in the Mafia's arsenal, but Luciano recognized its limits. Pure intimidation could provoke rebellion or unpredictable behavior. What he needed was a system in which men acted according to calculated self-interest. By aligning his allies' incentives with his goals, he ensured cooperation not through terror alone but through opportunity. Promises of territory, profit, and influence encouraged loyalty, while the implicit threat of death discouraged treachery. In this way, Luciano transformed fear into a structured mechanism for governance. The Castellamarese War reached its climax with two key assassinations that would forever change the course of organized crime. Mafia was eliminated in a carefully orchestrated ambush, executed by a team loyal to Luciano. Within months, Maranzano, believing himself the uncontested ruler of New York, was similarly betrayed and killed. These events were more than acts of revenge or ambition. They were calculated steps in the construction of a new order. With the old bosses removed, Luciano could implement his vision: families with defined territories, a council to mediate disputes, and a code that emphasized efficiency, loyalty, and profit over ancestry or emotion. Yet even as Luciano consolidated power, the moral weight of his actions was undeniable. To achieve progress, he had to order the deaths of men who had once been mentors, allies, or symbols of stability. The line between necessity and ruthlessness blurred. The psychological burden of this reality required a man who could compartmentalize, who could execute violence without succumbing to personal emotion. Luciano's capacity to reconcile ambition with morality, or the suppression of conventional morality, set him apart from his contemporaries. He was not merely a gangster. He was a revolutionary, a man capable of reshaping human behavior and institutions according to his design. The blood spilled during this period was not wasted. It became the foundation of a new architecture of power. By removing old allegiances and instituting clear rules, Luciano reduced the internal chaos that had plagued the Mafia for decades. Violence, while still a tool, was no longer arbitrary. It became a strategic instrument, employed to enforce order, reward loyalty, and eliminate obstacles. In doing so, Luciano demonstrated that brutality could coexist with organization, that fear, when codified, could become a stabilizing force rather than a destabilizing one. This period also revealed the transformative potential of alliances. Luciano's willingness to collaborate with Jewish and Irish gangsters, previously considered outsiders, expanded his operational capacity and introduced unprecedented efficiency. By leveraging diverse skills, networks, and resources, he created an interwoven system in which loyalty was measured by performance rather than heritage. These alliances, formed in the crucible of war, became the backbone of the National Crime Syndicate, a structure that would endure for decades. Ultimately, the blood of progress, as this era has been called, was both literal and symbolic. Luciano's rise required violence, betrayal, and the destruction of old norms, but it also demonstrated the possibilities inherent in innovation, strategy, and psychological insight. Through this crucible, Luciano proved that leadership in the criminal world could be as calculated, rational, and enduring as in any legitimate enterprise. He had turned chaos into opportunity, conflict into design, and brutality into a mechanism for systemic stability. By the end of the Castellamarese War, Lucky Luciano had accomplished something unprecedented. He had eliminated his rivals, unified the Italian-American gangs, and established the framework for a modern, organized, and rational criminal enterprise. Violence, once the language of survival, had been transformed into a tool of governance. Fear, once random, had been codified. And through it all, Luciano emerged not only as a survivor but as a visionary architect of the American Mafia, a man who understood that progress, even in crime, demanded structure, strategy, and sometimes blood. With the old guard eliminated, Charles Lucky Luciano faced the monumental task of consolidating power and transforming the chaotic underworld of New York into a structured enterprise. He understood that true dominance required more than muscle. It demanded a system that could endure beyond individual ambition or lifespan. This was the birth of what would become known as the Commission, a governing council designed to regulate, mediate, and coordinate the operations of the Mafia. The idea was revolutionary. Never before had organized crime in America attempted a formal structure that blended hierarchy with collective decision-making. Luciano envisioned a system in which power was shared, disputes were arbitrated, and territorial conflicts were minimized. The commission was not merely a bureaucratic innovation, it was a psychological tool. By creating a council, Luciano mitigated the risk of personal vendettas and impulsive violence. Each family retained autonomy over its territory, but major decisions, disputes, expansions, and key assassinations were subject to approval by the collective. This institutionalization of authority reduced chaos and established legitimacy in a world that had long operated on fear alone. It transformed the Mafia from a fragmented network of feuding families into a cohesive, national enterprise capable of strategic growth. Luciano's ability to forge alliances beyond the Italian-American community was central to the Commission's effectiveness. Jewish gangsters such as Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, and even Irish criminals with specialized influence, were integrated into operations where their skills and connections added value. Loyalty was defined not by blood or ethnicity but by competence and utility. Luciano recognized that the survival and prosperity of the new Mafia depended on practical collaboration rather than archaic notions of purity. By blending diverse groups into a single framework, he exponentially expanded both intelligence and operational reach. The structure of the commission reflected corporate logic. Each family had defined leadership, territories, and areas of responsibility. The council served as a board of directors, resolving conflicts that might otherwise escalate into deadly rivalries. Disputes over territory, money, or influence were mediated, reducing the likelihood of public violence and minimizing law enforcement scrutiny. Luciano understood that predictable systems, even in criminal enterprises, could create efficiency, loyalty, and long-term stability. Psychology played a crucial role in the success of this system. The old Mafia relied heavily on fear to command obedience, but Luciano's genius was in blending intimidation with opportunity. Associates were motivated to follow the rules not only because of potential punishment but because they could gain influence, wealth, and protection within the new hierarchy. This dual approach fostered loyalty while encouraging ambition, ensuring that capable operatives were incentivized to thrive under his authority. Through careful management, Luciano created a culture where self-interest aligned with organizational stability, a rare feat in any human institution. The commission also allowed Luciano to project power nationally without appearing overtly dominant. By mediating disputes between families in cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, and Detroit, he established himself as an arbiter rather than a tyrant. Other gangsters recognized that cooperation under his system offered far greater security and profitability than chaotic competition. Luciano's influence spread not by brute force alone but through the perception of inevitability, the sense that following the system he designed was the path to survival and success. In implementing the commission, Luciano demonstrated a profound understanding of organizational dynamics. He knew that centralized control could be both a liability and a source of strength. By distributing authority among the families while retaining strategic oversight, he reduced resentment and rebellion. At the same time, by embedding allies in key positions and maintaining control of critical operations, he ensured that his vision would not be undermined. This balance of decentralization and centralized influence became the defining feature of modern organized crime. The creation of the commission also marked a cultural shift. The old Mafia, steeped in Sicilian tradition, had valued honor, lineage, and rigid hierarchy. Luciano's system prioritized pragmatism, efficiency, and merit. This was not simply a structural change, it was a philosophical one. It reflected a new psychology of power in which intelligence, adaptability, and negotiation mattered as much as muscle. Ambition could be nurtured, but it was now channeled through rules that promoted collective stability rather than destructive rivalry. The influence of the commission extended beyond crime. Politicians, police, and legitimate businessmen soon learned that organized crime could be predictable, disciplined, and, at times, cooperative. Luciano's system allowed for negotiation with outsiders without compromising internal cohesion. Bribes, favors, and strategic alliances were integrated into the framework, making the Mafia a force that could shape not only the streets but also the broader social and economic landscape. By the mid-1930s, the Commission had transformed New York's underworld from a landscape of fear and chaos into a sophisticated network of interdependent families. Conflicts that had once erupted in public violence were now mediated behind closed doors. Power was codified and ambition was channeled through structured hierarchy. Luciano had achieved what many considered impossible. He had created a governing body for criminals, blending diplomacy, strategy, and psychological insight to ensure stability and prosperity. The establishment of the commission cemented Luciano's legacy as more than a gangster. He was a visionary architect of criminal governance. He had not only eliminated his rivals but had constructed a system that would endure for decades, guiding the behavior, loyalties, and ambitions of thousands of operatives. His genius lay in seeing beyond individual power. He designed an institution that outlasted its founder, institutionalizing rules, alliances, and mechanisms of control that continue to define organized crime. In effect, the commission made the Mafia predictable, professional, and immensely resilient. It institutionalized strategy, converted fear into structured compliance, and allowed diverse criminal groups to collaborate toward mutual benefit. Luciano's vision had transformed chaos into an enduring empire. It was the apex of his strategic thinking, blending psychology, diplomacy, and organizational theory into a framework that would define the underworld for generations to come. Beneath the polished exterior of Luciano's empire lay a network of codes, rituals, and unspoken rules that governed every interaction, every alliance, and every act of violence. This was the hidden war, a psychological battlefield as intricate as any gunfight or assassination. While the commission provided structure and governance, the true glue holding the system together was the code of omerta, the silence and loyalty that dictated behavior in the underworld. Breaking this code could mean death. Upholding it could mean survival, wealth, and influence. Understanding these laws, both written and unwritten, was essential to surviving, let alone thriving in Luciano's carefully orchestrated world. Omerta was more than a moral code, it was a psychological instrument. Fear alone could not sustain the new order. People needed internalized discipline, the kind that made loyalty instinctive. Betrayal was not punished merely to enforce rules, it was punished to reinforce a mental model of consequence. Every act of obedience, every moment of silence, became a reinforcement of the system itself. Luciano understood that humans are more motivated by perceived inevitability than by immediate threat. The law of silence created a culture in which loyalty became second nature, a self-reinforcing system that reduced the need for constant enforcement. The hidden war was also about perception. To outsiders, the Mafia appeared chaotic, violent, and unpredictable. To insiders, it was meticulously ordered, with clear hierarchies, assigned territories, and established protocols. Power was wielded subtly, often invisibly. Luciano's genius was in managing both realities simultaneously. He allowed the illusion of danger and spontaneity to persist, keeping rivals cautious, allies obedient, and law enforcement guessing. Psychological control, deception, and reputation were as essential as muscle in maintaining dominance. This period also highlighted the constant tension between internal loyalty and external threat. Families and associates were bound together by shared profits and fear, but ambitions, grudges, and insecurities were ever present. Even the most trusted lieutenants could become threats if unchecked. Luciano navigated this delicate balance with a combination of reward, surveillance, and selective intimidation. By rewarding loyalty with wealth and influence while subtly reminding everyone of the consequences of betrayal, he maintained a near-perfect equilibrium of power. The hidden war extended beyond human relationships to the control of operations themselves. Luciano understood that business and security were intertwined. Gambling dens, prostitution rings, narcotics networks, and labor rackets required oversight, enforcement, and diplomacy. Competent managers were rewarded. Incompetence or disloyalty was eliminated swiftly. This approach turned criminal enterprise into a disciplined, corporate-like structure, where psychological and operational control worked hand in hand. Every act of obedience reinforced hierarchy, and every act of rebellion became a lesson in consequence. Perhaps most importantly, the hidden war revealed Luciano's understanding of systemic risk. He recognized that law enforcement pressure, rival factions, and internal greed could destabilize even the most well-ordered empire. The Commission and the Code of Omerta were not merely reactive measures. They were proactive strategies to prevent chaos. By establishing predictable consequences and a clear framework for decision-making, Luciano minimized the likelihood of surprise attacks, sudden betrayals, and uncontrolled violence. In essence, he turned the unpredictability of human behavior into a manageable variable. Luciano also mastered the art of perception in this hidden war. He knew that reputation could be weaponized as effectively as a gun. Stories of ruthlessness, loyalty, and cunning were carefully cultivated, often exaggerated, to manipulate both allies and rivals. A single rumor could enforce compliance, redirect ambition, or neutralize a threat without bloodshed. This strategic manipulation of perception allowed Luciano to project omnipresence and omniscience, qualities that reinforced both fear and respect. The hidden war was not only external but deeply internal as well. Luciano had to constantly navigate his own psychology, balancing ambition, morality, and risk. The consolidation of power required ruthless decision-making and the ability to compartmentalize actions. Every execution, betrayal, and negotiation had to be weighed against the long-term stability of the empire. He was not merely fighting other gangs, he was fighting entropy itself, the tendency for chaos, greed, and emotion to unravel his meticulously constructed system. By the mid-1930s, Luciano had mastered the interplay between structure and psychology. The Mafia was no longer a loose network of violent gangs. It was a disciplined organization in which rules were internalized, behavior was predictable, and loyalty was cultivated as much through opportunity as through fear. The hidden war was won not just with bullets but with influence, strategy, and the careful orchestration of human behavior. This period underscores a crucial truth about Luciano's genius. Power in the underworld was as much about understanding the human mind as it was about controlling territory or wealth. By codifying loyalty, manipulating perception, and managing ambition, he created a system that could endure. The hidden war, fought in shadows, whispers, and calculated acts of violence, ensured that the Mafia became a resilient institution. Every decision, every action, and every unspoken rule contributed to a culture in which obedience and self-interest aligned seamlessly, the cornerstone of the modern American Mafia. In essence, the hidden war was the psychological backbone of Luciano's empire. While the public saw only headlines, assassinations, and scandals, the real battle was internal. The careful calibration of human behavior, the maintenance of fear, loyalty, and opportunity, and the orchestration of a society governed by unspoken laws. This mastery of both structure and psychology allowed Luciano to dominate not through brute force alone, but through foresight, manipulation, and an understanding of what truly motivates people. His empire was secure not because men feared him alone, but because they understood that the system he built was inevitable, enduring, and inescapable. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano had built an empire unlike anything the American underworld had ever seen. Families were organized, alliances were forged across ethnic lines, and the commission governed disputes with an almost corporate efficiency. Yet even the most carefully constructed empires are vulnerable, and Luciano's was no exception. Despite his power, he faced a convergence of threats: ambitious rivals, law enforcement scrutiny, and the inherent instability of human loyalty. The very system that made him formidable also made him a target. The fall of the architect of America's organized crime was beginning, subtle, inevitable, and fraught with irony. The first cracks appeared in the form of legal pressure. Thomas E. Dewey, a rising star in law enforcement, had made it his mission to dismantle organized crime in New York. Dewey understood that prosecuting Luciano would require more than ordinary investigation. It demanded meticulous attention to the network of illicit operations, witnesses, and paper trails. He capitalized on public outrage, media attention, and political will to build cases that could withstand scrutiny. Luciano, who had long relied on influence, intimidation, and discretion, found that the law could now threaten the very foundation of his empire. Complicating matters were internal betrayals. Even within the commission, ambitions simmered beneath the surface. Associates who had once been loyal began weighing personal gain against allegiance. The intricate network of trust that Luciano had cultivated was vulnerable to greed, fear, and coercion. For a man who had risen by manipulating both perception and loyalty, this emerging instability was particularly dangerous. Every interaction, every deal became a calculated gamble, a test of whether the empire could withstand not only external attacks but internal fractures. The mechanisms of his eventual downfall began quietly. Raids on gambling dens, brothels, and nightclubs disrupted operations and created public spectacle. Victims of exploitation, particularly women coerced into prostitution rings, became witnesses in cases that would eventually ensnare him. The very human cost of his empire, once carefully hidden behind layers of intimidation and secrecy, began to emerge in courts and headlines. Luciano's brilliance at managing perception was now tested. The illusion of untouchability started to crumble. The arrest of Luciano in 1936 marked the formal beginning of his fall. He was charged with compulsory prostitution and operating a criminal enterprise. While these charges may have seemed narrowly defined compared to the vast scope of his criminal network, they were strategically sufficient to dismantle his freedom. Dewey and his team had constructed a case that combined legal rigor with public pressure, ensuring that Luciano could not rely solely on influence or intimidation to escape justice. For the man who had orchestrated empires and eliminated rivals with precision, the law now represented a threat that could not be negotiated away. Psychologically, this period was a test of resilience. Luciano had spent his life calculating risk, anticipating betrayal, and manipulating outcomes. Now he confronted a force that combined legal authority with social scrutiny, and he realized that his usual tools, fear, loyalty, bribery, were less effective. Associates distanced themselves, public opinion turned, and the machinery of justice moved inexorably toward him. The irony was profound. The system he had built to govern human behavior could not protect him from an external institution operating under different rules. Yet even as the fall began, Luciano's instincts remained sharp. From his initial arrest, he worked to mitigate damage, negotiating with allies, leveraging information, and seeking to maintain influence even in confinement. The seeds of control he had planted over years allowed him to continue shaping events from behind the scenes, but the dynamic had shifted. He was no longer the omnipotent architect. He was a target navigating a landscape now governed by law, chance, and the ambitions of others. The psychological tension during this period was profound. For decades, Luciano had operated on the principle that every action had a predictable reaction, that loyalty could be engineered and obedience could be cultivated. Now, unpredictability dominated. Witnesses acted according to conscience or fear, law enforcement acted according to procedure and public pressure, and former allies sought self-preservation. The illusion of invincibility, carefully constructed through charisma, strategy, and fear, was beginning to collapse. The fall of Luciano was also a narrative of hubris meeting consequence. His rise had been marked by brilliance in organization, strategic foresight, and psychological mastery. But no matter how carefully the empire had been constructed, external forces and human frailty could not be fully controlled. The very visibility and success that defined his genius also made him a target for prosecution, betrayal, and public scrutiny. In dismantling his rivals and consolidating power, Luciano had inevitably attracted the attention of forces determined to bring him down. By the end of this period, the fall of the architect was evident, though not complete. Arrest, indictment, and betrayal had weakened his position, but Luciano's mind remained a strategic weapon. Even as his freedom was curtailed, he sought to influence outcomes, protect allies, and secure his legacy. The beginning of the end had arrived, but it would unfold over the next crucial years, revealing both the vulnerabilities and enduring cunning of the man who had reshaped American organized crime. The early stages of Luciano's downfall highlight a paradox central to his life. The skills that allow a man to rise, vision, manipulation, and control, can also make him a target. In the careful orchestration of empire, the architect of power is always exposed to forces beyond his control. Luciano's story at this moment is one of tension, irony, and impending transformation, the powerful mastermind confronting the inexorable consequences of ambition, law, and human unpredictability. The trial of Lucky Luciano in 1936 was more than a courtroom drama. It was a spectacle that captured the attention of an entire nation. Newspapers splashed his name across front pages, sensationalizing every detail of his alleged crimes. To the public, he was a symbol of the lawlessness and corruption that had plagued the 1920s and early 1930s. To law enforcement, he was the prize that would demonstrate their ability to assert authority over organized crime. To Luciano himself, the trial was both a personal and strategic battle, a confrontation in which every word, every gesture, and every witness had the potential to shape the outcome of his empire and his freedom. From the outset, the prosecution framed the case as a moral crusade. Luciano was accused of running a vast prostitution ring, coercing women into sexual slavery, and operating a criminal enterprise that corrupted law enforcement and politicians. The charges, while narrower than the full scope of his criminal operations, were devastating in their social implications. The narrative presented to the public was simple and morally resonant. A man of cunning and influence exploiting the vulnerable, undermining society, and flouting the law. In the courtroom, Luciano was painted as both ruthless and remorseless, a man whose charm and intelligence masked a profound immorality. The courtroom itself became a theater of psychological warfare. Luciano, ever aware of the importance of perception, maintained a calm, composed demeanor. He projected confidence, subtle charisma, and unflappable control, traits that had served him in the streets and boardrooms of the underworld. Observers noted his cool detachment, his measured responses, and the way he seemed to command attention without aggression. Even as witnesses recounted abuse, coercion, and manipulation, Luciano's presence reminded the court and the public that power could manifest not only in action but in poise, intellect, and reputation. Witnesses played a central role in the trial. Women coerced into prostitution testified against him, recounting the fear, exploitation, and violence that had defined their interactions with the empire he controlled. Each account chipped away at the carefully constructed image of invincibility that Luciano had cultivated. At the same time, former associates and lower-ranking gang members were pressured to provide testimony. Loyalty, once a shield, was fractured by legal pressure and the promise of leniency. The psychological dynamics in the courtroom mirrored the hidden war Luciano had waged for decades. Control versus rebellion, loyalty versus self-interest, perception versus reality. Public fascination with the trial added a new dimension. Newspapers and radio broadcasts transformed the legal proceedings into a narrative drama. Citizens who had once lived in fear of Luciano now followed the trial with rapt attention, analyzing every twist, every statement, and every strategic move. The media framed him as both villain and anti-hero, a man whose intelligence and audacity fascinated even as his crimes horrified. This duality, fear mixed with fascination, mirrored the psychological control Luciano had always wielded in the underworld, only now it was wielded by the court, press, and public against him. Legal strategy played a decisive role. Dewey and his prosecutors meticulously assembled evidence, exploiting every opportunity to link Luciano to criminal operations. They understood that proving the full extent of his empire was challenging, so they focused on charges that were both compelling and legally sustainable. Luciano's defense faced an uphill battle, contending not only with evidence but with the weight of public perception. The courtroom became a stage where morality, legality, and social outrage intersected, each influencing the outcome in ways as subtle and complex as the negotiations Luciano had mastered in his criminal enterprises. The trial also exposed the vulnerability of even the most disciplined criminal networks. The very alliances, loyalty structures, and codes that had ensured the stability of Luciano's empire for years were now tested by legal pressure. Associates feared implication, betraying confidences and complicating his defense. The power of influence, so carefully cultivated on the streets, could not entirely withstand the machinery of law and the social mechanisms of shame, publicity, and fear of incarceration. The trial became not only a legal battle but a psychological siege, in which the perception of inevitability and vulnerability weighed heavily on both the defendant and his network. As testimony unfolded, the contrast between Luciano's composure and the chaos of the proceedings highlighted a recurring theme of his life: the interplay of intelligence, strategy, and human behavior. He had risen by understanding the motivations, weaknesses, and fears of others. Now he faced adversaries who applied the same principles against him. Every word in court, every expression, every public reaction was a variable to be managed. The trial was as much about narrative control as it was about legal culpability, a reflection of the hidden war Luciano had long mastered. Ultimately, the courtroom drama culminated in a conviction, sentencing Luciano to a long prison term. The verdict was both a personal and symbolic turning point, the fall of the man who had redefined organized crime, the moment when law, public scrutiny, and morality converged to challenge his empire. Yet even in defeat, Luciano's strategic mind continued to operate. He began planning how to maintain influence, safeguard allies, and negotiate for eventual freedom. His empire, though constrained, was not yet dismantled. The trial had shifted the battlefield from the streets to the cells and corridors of legal negotiation, but the war for control continued. The trial of Lucky Luciano stands as a pivotal moment in the history of organized crime. It illustrates the interplay of law, psychology, and social perception in the maintenance and disruption of power. While it marked the beginning of his formal downfall, it also highlighted the resilience of his intellect, the durability of the systems he created, and the enduring influence of a man who understood better than anyone the human mind. The courtroom became a new arena for strategy, survival, and negotiation, one where Luciano's genius would be tested in ways that violence alone could never achieve. Even behind bars, Lucky Luciano's influence over the criminal underworld remained formidable. Prison, for most men, represents the end of power, a place where control, authority, and freedom are stripped away. But for Luciano, it became another theater in which to exercise his strategic genius. From the confines of a cell, he continued to oversee operations, manage alliances and manipulate outcomes. His understanding of human psychology, loyalty, and fear allowed him to extend his reach far beyond the prison walls, proving that true power is not solely dependent on physical freedom. Luciano's incarceration did not silence him. It reshaped the way he wielded influence. He maintained communication with key associates through a network of intermediaries, bribed officials, and loyal messengers. These connections ensured that orders were executed, profits continued to flow, and disputes were mediated in accordance with his vision. By remaining involved in strategic decisions, he preserved the structure of the commission, ensuring that the families continued to operate efficiently and cohesively. The empire he had painstakingly built remained intact, even under the pressure of confinement. Psychologically, prison tested Luciano's resilience in unprecedented ways. Stripped of direct control, he had to rely entirely on perception, manipulation, and indirect influence. Associates were aware that decisions he made from behind bars carried the weight of authority, but they also had to navigate their own ambitions and fears. Luciano's genius was in balancing these dynamics, offering incentives, subtly signaling consequences, and maintaining the illusion of omnipresence. Even in captivity, he remained the central node of the criminal network, a figure whose intellect and strategic foresight commanded respect and obedience. The period behind bars also highlighted Luciano's adaptability. He could not rely on intimidation in the traditional sense. Physical coercion was impossible. Instead, he leveraged the principles he had long used: psychological control, loyalty through opportunity, and the careful calibration of fear and reward. Associates who managed operations outside the prison understood that compliance ensured prosperity and protection, while deviation carried the risk of retribution orchestrated through proxies. Luciano's ability to adapt his leadership style to the limitations of confinement reinforced his status as a master strategist. Luciano's influence was also extended through strategic alliances with political and law enforcement figures. He recognized that survival and power required collaboration with institutions traditionally considered adversarial. By negotiating deals, offering intelligence, or leveraging influence in matters of national interest, particularly during World War II, Luciano positioned himself as an indispensable intermediary. His capacity to navigate these relationships further cemented his control over the criminal network, even when physically restrained. The prison walls could not contain the reach of a mind capable of calculating risk, manipulating perception, and orchestrating events at a distance. During this period, Luciano also refined the operational aspects of the commission. He monitored territory disputes, oversaw the division of profits, and ensured that strategic alliances remained intact. His approach emphasized merit, loyalty, and efficiency, principles he had long championed. By institutionalizing these values, he minimized the risk that internal conflict would destabilize the organization. Even from prison, he was able to enforce discipline, resolve disputes, and guide the evolution of the Mafia into a more resilient institution. The psychological pressure of imprisonment, however, was constant. Luciano had to navigate a world in which information was filtered, communication was indirect, and every action carried potential consequences. Yet his experiences on the streets, combined with his understanding of human behavior, allowed him to turn these constraints into strategic advantages. By controlling information, maintaining alliances, and projecting authority, he transformed the prison from a site of vulnerability into a platform for influence. Luciano's ability to exercise power from behind bars also reshaped perceptions of criminal authority. Associates, rivals, and law enforcement alike recognized that confinement did not diminish his capacity for strategic oversight. This reinforced a central principle of Luciano's leadership: true influence extends beyond physical presence. Power is embedded in perception, relationships, and the ability to orchestrate outcomes, all of which Luciano maintained with precision. Despite the restrictions, Luciano continued to cultivate his legacy. He mentored rising figures within the organization, transmitted his philosophies, and ensured that his methods of governance, strategic thinking, and psychological insight were institutionalized. The principles that had guided his rise, loyalty, efficiency, and calculated ruthlessness, continued to shape the Mafia, even in his absence from the streets. Ultimately, Luciano's time in prison underscores the breadth of his genius. He demonstrated that leadership is not confined to physical command. It resides in the capacity to influence, manipulate, and orchestrate complex systems of human behavior. Even as the law stripped him of freedom, he maintained control over his empire, safeguarding its structure, profitability, and cohesion. In doing so, Luciano redefined the nature of power in organized crime, proving that intellect, strategy, and psychological mastery can transcend physical limitations. After years behind bars, Lucky Luciano's story took an unexpected turn that would reshape the final chapters of his life. World events, particularly the outbreak of World War II, created circumstances that even the law could not ignore. The U.S. government, facing the threat of Axis sabotage along the eastern seaboard, recognized the unique value of Luciano's influence over the criminal networks controlling ports, docks, and shipping operations. Despite his imprisonment, his knowledge and connections positioned him as a strategic asset. In a remarkable twist, the man who had once been deemed America's most dangerous criminal would now be courted by the very institutions that had sought to confine him. Negotiations between Luciano and government officials were delicate and clandestine. His assistance was offered in exchange for leniency, creating a moral and political paradox. The government needed access to the underworld to protect vital shipping lanes, while Luciano sought a path to freedom and the restoration of his influence. This arrangement, part pragmatic necessity, part moral compromise, reflected the complicated interplay between power, survival, and the shifting ethics of wartime. Luciano, ever the strategist, recognized the opportunity and leveraged it to negotiate his eventual release. In 1946, Luciano was released from prison under conditions that effectively exiled him to Italy. This marked a dramatic shift in both his personal life and his empire. While free to move geographically, he was restricted from returning to the United States for a decade. Exile, however, did not signify the end of influence. Luciano had already established systems and alliances robust enough to continue operating without his physical presence. The empire he had built, structured, loyal, and disciplined, remained resilient, a testament to the foresight and psychological acumen that had guided his rise. Luciano's exile also brought introspection. Removed from the streets that had forged him, he confronted questions of legacy, mortality, and the meaning of power. Italy, with its familiar culture yet distant political realities, offered both comfort and isolation. He maintained connections with former associates, monitored operations, and continued to advise on strategic matters, yet the distance forced a re-evaluation of his identity. The man who had commanded New York's underworld now existed as both architect and observer, witnessing the enduring structures he had created while grappling with the limitations imposed by exile. Despite the geographical separation, Luciano's influence continued to shape organized crime globally. His strategies, meritocratic alliances, structured families, and the governing principles of the Commission had been internalized by his lieutenants. These men executed operations, resolved disputes, and maintained the stability of the network in accordance with his philosophy. Luciano's legacy was thus not dependent on his physical presence. His ideas and institutional frameworks had achieved a form of immortality within the criminal world. The exile period also illuminated Luciano's adaptability. Confronted with restrictions and distance, he shifted from operational leadership to advisory and strategic oversight. He cultivated international connections, monitored the flow of information and resources, and continued to exercise influence over key decisions. In essence, exile became a different form of control, less visible, less immediate, but still potent. Luciano demonstrated that power is not merely about proximity but about the capacity to orchestrate systems, relationships, and incentives effectively. Psychologically, the endgame of Luciano's life was marked by a complex interplay of triumph, regret, and reflection. He had achieved nearly everything he had envisioned: an organized, disciplined mafia that transcended ethnicity and geography, an enduring empire capable of withstanding upheaval, and a personal legacy defined by strategic brilliance. Yet the price was evident. Freedom had been compromised, alliances had been tested, and the life he had once commanded directly was now observed from a distance. The exile forced a reconciliation between ambition realized and control partially relinquished. Even in his final years, Luciano's reputation remained formidable. He was both revered and feared, a figure whose intellect and influence shaped not only criminal operations but also perceptions of organized crime in popular culture and law enforcement strategy. He became a living symbol of the modern mafia, a man who had demonstrated that discipline, organization, and psychological insight could transform chaos into enduring power. Exile had not diminished his myth. If anything, it had amplified the aura of a man who had mastered both the streets and the minds of those who walked them. Ultimately, the exile and endgame of Lucky Luciano's life illustrate the intersection of power, circumstance, and legacy. Though physically removed from the empire he built, His influence persisted through the systems, alliances, and cultural norms he had instilled. Exile became a stage for reflection, adaptation, and continued strategic oversight. It marked the final act in a life defined by intelligence, ruthlessness, and vision, the culmination of a journey in which the architect of America's organized crime learned that true power often lies not in presence but in design, foresight, and the ability to shape events from afar. Lucky Luciano's legacy is both monumental and paradoxical, defined by brilliance, ruthlessness, and the enduring structures he left behind. He was not merely a gangster. He was an architect, a strategist who transformed the chaotic, violent underworld of the early 20th century into a disciplined, enduring institution. His innovations, the creation of the commission, the systematization of families, and the codification of loyalty and operational efficiency, reshaped organized crime not only in New York but across the United States and eventually internationally. Luciano's genius lay in seeing beyond immediate power. He designed systems that could function independently, survive leadership changes, and endure scrutiny from law enforcement, politics, and public perception. At the heart of Luciano's legacy is the concept of organization. Before his rise, the Mafia was fragmented, violent, and inefficient. Feuds were frequent, alliances were fragile, and leadership was often based on birthright rather than competence. Luciano introduced meritocracy, strategic planning, and interethnic alliances that transformed the underworld into a network capable of coordinated action, conflict resolution, and long-term profitability. By prioritizing intelligence, loyalty, and efficiency over tradition, he created a model that could withstand internal rivalries and external threats. This structural innovation is a cornerstone of his enduring influence, one that continues to inform both criminal enterprises and the study of organizational psychology. Equally significant was Luciano's psychological mastery. He understood that fear alone could not sustain loyalty or control. Opportunity, reward, and perception were equally essential. Associates were motivated to perform, innovate, and remain loyal because doing so aligned with their personal ambitions and survival. By blending intimidation with incentive, Luciano created a culture in which obedience was internalized rather than enforced purely through threat. This nuanced understanding of human behavior allowed him to maintain control over a complex, sprawling network, ensuring that his influence persisted even during periods of incarceration or exile. Luciano's impact extended beyond structural and psychological innovations. He demonstrated the power of adaptability and strategic foresight. From navigating the Prohibition era to orchestrating the Castellamarese War, managing the commission, and even negotiating his freedom through cooperation with wartime authorities, Luciano consistently anticipated risks and leveraged opportunities. His ability to operate at the intersection of law, politics, and organized crime set him apart from contemporaries who relied solely on violence or intimidation. He was a man who understood systems, not just streets. The ethical and moral dimensions of Luciano's legacy are more complex. He achieved his ambitions through violence, betrayal, and exploitation. Countless lives were affected by the operations he orchestrated, and the pursuit of power often came at a profound human cost. Yet it is precisely this blend of ruthlessness and strategic intelligence that defines his historical significance. Luciano forced a reconsideration of what power looks like in a criminal context. It is not merely brute strength, but the ability to structure, influence, and sustain a system over time. In this sense, his legacy is as much about the method of control as it is about the results. Culturally, Luciano's life has become emblematic of the American Mafia itself. He represents the transition from chaotic, ethnically insular gangs to organized, nationalized criminal enterprises. Movies, television, and literature have immortalized him, sometimes mythologizing his persona, but always acknowledging the transformation he catalyzed. The idea of the Mafia as a disciplined, strategic, and internally governed organization owes much to Luciano's vision. In many ways he became both a historical figure and a symbol, the embodiment of modern organized crime. Furthermore, Luciano's innovations had global implications. His model of alliances, commissions, and codified loyalty influenced criminal enterprises beyond the United States, providing a blueprint for structured organized crime worldwide. By demonstrating that cooperation, meritocracy, and strategic planning could coexist with criminal activity, he redefined how syndicates could operate, survive, and even thrive in the face of law enforcement and social upheaval. His systems proved resilient, adaptable, and, in some cases, virtually untouchable, setting the standard for decades of underworld organization. Luciano's legacy is also a study in the psychology of leadership. He demonstrated that control is not about constant oversight but about the ability to shape incentives, influence perception, and create structures that internalize obedience. Associates operated efficiently because the system made compliance rational and betrayal costly. He proved that power could be both decentralized and centralized simultaneously, a paradox that underlies the resilience of his empire. His life remains a case study in strategic thinking, organizational design, and the manipulation of human behavior in complex social systems. In reflecting on Lucky Luciano's life, one must acknowledge both the brilliance and the brutality. His empire brought order to chaos, efficiency to violence, and strategy to crime. Yet it also exacted a profound human toll and was built on exploitation, deception, and death. The duality of his legacy, visionary and ruthless, brilliant and morally ambiguous, is precisely what makes him a compelling figure in the history of organized crime. His influence endures not only in the structures he left behind but in the lessons his life provides about power, strategy, and the human psyche. Ultimately, Luciano's legacy is that of a man who saw the potential for order in disorder, strategy in chaos, and longevity in adaptability. He transformed the American Mafia from a collection of feuding gangs into a disciplined, enduring institution capable of surviving both internal rivalries and external scrutiny. His systems, strategies, and psychological insights have left an indelible mark on organized crime, making him a figure whose influence persists long after his death. Lucky Luciano was not just a criminal. He was an architect of power, a strategist of human behavior, and a visionary whose imprint reshaped the underworld forever. The story of Lucky Luciano is one of paradox, brilliance, and the relentless pursuit of power, a journey that spans the gritty streets of New York to the clandestine corridors of organized crime, and finally to the reflective exile of his later years. From his earliest days, he was shaped by a world that demanded cunning, resilience, and adaptability. Born into poverty, he learned to navigate the brutal realities of immigrant neighborhoods, where survival was often dictated by strength, wit, and the ability to read people with uncanny precision. These formative years were more than a backdrop. They were the crucible that forged the psychological tools that would later define his extraordinary rise. Every decision, every alliance, and every calculated risk was informed by a deep understanding of human behavior, the motivations, fears, and ambitions that drive men in both the streets and the boardrooms of the underworld. Luciano's ascent was neither linear nor inevitable. It was shaped by violence, betrayal, and the careful orchestration of chaos into opportunity. In dismantling the old guard during the Castellamarese War, he demonstrated a rare combination of strategic foresight and moral detachment. Where others saw conflict, he saw a chance to design a new order. The ruthlessness required to eliminate Masuria and Maranzano was staggering, yet it was also precise, deliberate, and visionary. These were not mere acts of revenge or ambition. They were calculated maneuvers designed to transform the fragmented, volatile underworld into a disciplined and enduring system. In doing so, Luciano redefined the concept of power, showing that true influence is as much about systems and psychology as it is about brute force. The creation of the Commission marked the pinnacle of this transformation. By institutionalizing conflict resolution, codifying loyalty, and integrating diverse criminal factions into a cooperative framework, Luciano created a structure that was both resilient and efficient. The genius of the Commission lay not just in its governance of crime, but in its understanding of human nature. Fear, ambition, and opportunity were carefully calibrated to maintain loyalty and obedience, demonstrating that psychological insight is as critical to leadership as strategic action. Luciano's ability to balance decentralization with centralized influence allowed for both autonomy and cohesion, ensuring the survival of his empire even as external pressures intensified. This innovation would become the blueprint for organized crime across the nation, proving that even in illegal enterprises, order, foresight, and governance could triumph over chaos. Yet, power is never absolute, and Luciano's empire was not immune to vulnerability. The pressures of law enforcement, the ambitions of rivals, and the inherent unpredictability of human loyalty eventually exposed cracks in the foundation he had meticulously built. His arrest in 1936 and the subsequent trial revealed the limits of influence when confronted with the machinery of justice. For the first time, Luciano faced an adversary he could not manipulate through fear, incentive, or perception: the law. The courtroom became a new battlefield, one where intellect and strategy were tested against evidence, public opinion, and the moral authority of the state. Even here, Luciano's composure, intelligence, and strategic thinking were evident. He remained the central figure in the narrative, managing perceptions, influencing outcomes, and ensuring that his network continued to operate despite his incarceration. Prison, often the final stage for those who live by power and violence, became for Luciano another theater of influence. Behind bars, he maintained communication with his associates, oversaw operations, and ensured that the commission continued to function efficiently. The genius of his leadership was revealed in the fact that even when physically constrained, his authority was unquestioned. Luciano demonstrated that power is not solely about presence. It resides in the ability to orchestrate systems, manage human behavior, and maintain influence through perception and incentive. His time in confinement underscored a central theme of his life. True control extends beyond immediate action and relies on shaping the structures and behaviors that define an organization. Exile, while stripping him of the streets he had dominated, did not diminish his influence. In Italy, he continued to advise, observe, and guide the operations he had established, demonstrating adaptability and foresight. The circumstances that led to his release, cooperation with the U.S. government during World War II, illustrate the complexity of his life, where morality, pragmatism, and ambition intersected. Here was a man who had once been the most feared criminal in America now negotiating with authorities to secure his freedom, leveraging his unique expertise for survival. Exile became a reflective stage, where Luciano could witness the enduring impact of his vision while reconciling with the limitations imposed by circumstance. The systems he had created, the alliances he had nurtured, and the psychological insights he had employed all continued to operate in his absence, proving that his genius lay not only in action but in design. Luciano's legacy is deeply intertwined with the evolution of organized crime itself. He transformed the Mafia from a loose collection of violent gangs into a disciplined, enduring institution. The principles he established, strategic governance, meritocratic leadership, and psychologically calibrated loyalty, set a standard that would influence criminal enterprises for decades. But his impact goes beyond crime. It offers enduring lessons about leadership, strategy, and human behavior. Luciano demonstrated that power is most effective when embedded in structures, reinforced by incentives, and guided by an understanding of what motivates people. His life is a masterclass in the intersection of intellect, psychology, and organizational design, showing that even in morally ambiguous contexts, strategy and foresight can create lasting influence. The psychological dimension of his legacy is equally profound. Luciano understood that fear alone could not sustain loyalty. By blending intimidation with opportunity, he ensured that obedience was internalized and ambition was channeled toward organizational stability. This nuanced understanding of human motivation allowed him to control complex systems with precision, a skill that remained evident even during his incarceration and exile. He recognized that the most resilient power is that which shapes behavior, aligns interests, and institutionalizes authority, lessons that remain relevant far beyond the criminal world. Yet, Luciano's life also forces us to confront moral ambiguity. His empire was built on violence, coercion, and exploitation. Countless lives were impacted by his operations, and the pursuit of power often came at a devastating human cost. These ethical contradictions are central to understanding his story. They remind us that genius and ruthlessness are often intertwined, and that the pursuit of enduring influence can require morally complex decisions. Luciano's life is a study in the tension between ambition and consequence, between strategic brilliance and ethical compromise, offering insight into the complexities of human behavior under extreme conditions. Culturally, Luciano has become a symbol, the archetype of the modern American Mafia. He represents the transition from chaotic street gangs to structured, national criminal enterprises. His life has been mythologized in films, literature, and popular culture, reflecting both fascination and fear. Yet behind the myth lies a man of extraordinary intellect, foresight, and strategic mastery. He demonstrated that leadership is as much about vision and planning as it is about action, and that the structures one builds can outlast personal fortune, freedom, and even life itself. Ultimately, Luciano's story is one of transformation, personal, organizational, and societal. He transformed himself from a street kid into a mastermind, chaos into order, and fear into a system of loyalty and obedience. He demonstrated that power is most durable when it is institutionalized, when it aligns individual ambition with organizational stability, and when it anticipates the unpredictable variables of human behavior. His life is a testament to the interplay of strategy, psychology, and circumstance, showing how a single individual can reshape the contours of an entire social system. In reflecting on Luciano's journey, we are reminded that legacy is measured not only by immediate accomplishments but by enduring influence. The Mafia he left behind was resilient, disciplined, and strategically governed, a testament to the systems, philosophies, and psychological insights he cultivated. His life challenges us to consider the nature of power, the ethics of influence, and the complexities of human behavior. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to operate at multiple levels simultaneously: the streets, the system, the mind, and the legacy. He was both participant and architect, actor and observer, criminal and strategist. In conclusion, Lucky Luciano's life is more than a story of crime. It is a study of vision, intellect, and the human capacity to shape systems, institutions, and people. His rise and fall, his genius and ruthlessness, his adaptability and foresight, all contribute to a legacy that continues to captivate and instruct. He demonstrated that true power lies not only in action but in design, not only in dominance but in understanding, and not only in fear but in loyalty and structure. Luciano's story lingers because it transcends the boundaries of the underworld, offering lessons on leadership, psychology, and the pursuit of enduring influence. His life is a testament to the enduring tension between genius and vulnerability, ambition and consequence, myth and reality, a balance that defines the greatest figures in crime and beyond.